Well, at times like this, I feel like an Egyptian mummy. I've got so many things I want to say. Why an Egyptian mummy? Because we're pressed for time. Anyhow, we're delighted to be here. My wife and I have made a lot of friends. There's a wonderful Hebrew phrase, Ezehu mechubad hamechabed et habriot. Who is honored, who is respected most? He who shows respect to other people. And we have found since we're here that that's a wonderful motto for this place. We've made good friends. A lot of you have made good friends, and we should all be grateful because the Hebrew tradition is a good tradition. Who is honored most? He who gives honor to other human beings. And I also want to say a nice word about the Federation. I know the federations from most of the federations in the world because of my previous work. And I think this is an exceptional federation. I know of no other federation which has had the vision to purchase many years ago 100 acres and to build major Jewish institutions. And I think the Jewish Federation here should be highly complimented for its exceptional character. And I'm delighted that we are the beneficiaries of the wonderful work of the Federation. When Bella saw the announcement to this program, my life, she said, oi, and she told me a story that she loves to tell about the famous world-renowned professor who received an honorary doctorate. And after 50 years of being one of the great professors in the world, and he came home and he was so filled with the many accolades which have been given to him that he said, you know, dear, there are really very few great people in this world. And she said, yes, dear, and there's one less than you think. So I apologize in advance to my wife if I have overextended my welcome, and if because we decided that I should talk about some of the things that have happened to our lives. I've never incidentally given this kind of talk. I just usually blast away at all kinds of issues. But here I'm going to talk about our personal lives because I got to talk about my life. So I apologize to Bella in advance if I overextend myself. She wants to keep me honest, or modest. Anyhow, I thought I'd start out by talking a little bit about our marriage. Why our marriage? Because my perception of what is important in life is family. So I want to tell you, some of you have already heard this story. As a matter of fact, as I recall our various conversations with many of you, you sit down around the table and the first thing you said is, how did you meet? You meet again the next night, how did you meet? So I'm doing it again, as some of you may have heard, but I think we had an exceptional marriage. I was in Denver, Colorado. Members of my congregation owned Samsonite luggage and Lego. They were big machers. Denver, as you know, is on the foot of the Rocky Mountains. And they had a summer estate which my congregation converted into a summer camp for children. And I had hired the whole staff. I was responsible for the camp. I had hired the whole staff, and I just couldn't find a nurse. And I heard that there was a nurse from Israel who was visiting. So I called her up and asked her to come for an interview. And she came, and I found out that she'd been born and reared in the Soviet Union on the border of Siberia. No Jews, no synagogue. She had come to Israel miraculously on a ship which landed, the first ship to enter the Jewish state after the Jewish state was declared. And since she was a nurse, she was sent to the front lines and was the only woman with 60 men for many months on the front lines. Anyhow, I told her about the camp, and she was planning on going west. She'd gotten to Denver to visit the relatives, and I persuaded her to come to camp. She could teach Israeli songs and dances and all that. The last time I really persuaded her of anything, incidentally. So camp closed on Sunday, and Tuesday we went to get married. We never had a date. I never took her to a movie, never took her to a dinner. We just got married. And it's been a great marriage. And the reason I talk about that is that I think that marriage is the most important institution in which I've been involved and in which you are involved. You have all been involved. Marriage is the institution which enables human beings to reenact God's creation. The family is a microcosm of all humankind. Marriage encourages finite human beings to reach toward infinity. The Zohar teaches us that in causing marriages to take place, God is constantly creating new worlds. And the closest a human being can come to being godlike is to bear a family, rear a family. So that it's a very important aspect of life. And when I tell you about some of the institutions in which I've been involved, there's no institution which is more important than marriage. Bill and I were blessed with 4 children, born in 3.5 years. We didn't monkey around right away. Not so easy, at least for the wife. They have 4 children in 3.5 years. We set certain standards. I believed, and we believed, that the home is basically an institution of education. Bella and I, since we were privileged to both speak Hebrew, decided that from the moment our kids were born, and they lived growing up in Chicago and in Washington, we decided that our home would have Hebrew as the language of the home. So our kids grew up. I think we were the only family I knew at the time whose mother tongue, growing up in Chicago and Washington, was Hebrew. Why? Because we thought that it was important to be a Jew. And to be a Jew means to know the Jewish language, which is Hebrew. At the time, we had no intention of going out of the aisle. What would a Reform rabbi do in Israel? This was in 1954. So in Jewish tradition, the home is designated as a mikdash ma'at, a little sanctuary. And one has to look at the family as if it were a sanctuary. It so happened we had mazel, our kids turned out okay. We got 3 professors of medicine and never one rabbi. The ultimate goal of the home is to serve as an educational center. For Jews, the family becomes a congregation, and the family table is an altar. And it's a place for the inculcation of values, not only the shaping of the mind, but the sharpening of the mind, the shaping of a mensch. and that was our aspiration. Children's character is determined not so much by what parents say, but by how parents live. Now, so why do I start with our marriage? Because to me, that's the first institution in which I was privileged to be involved. And it's been a privilege that my wife, home, family are integral to everything which follows. Now, what follows? Well, from 1962 to 1973, I served in Washington. I was the founding director of the Religious Action Center of the Reform Movement. And so in a way, I've always thought that, and from 1973 till the present, actually, we were in Jerusalem. And I've always thought that our life can be summarized by saying that it's a tale of two cities. Washington, the capital and symbol of democracy for the world, and Jerusalem, the capital of the Jewish people and the pulsating heart of Jewish destiny. And what did I discover during these travels? That ultimately there are no geographical borders or ideological boundaries which can divide Jewish minds and Jewish hearts and Jewish destiny. Some of us last night were talking about one of the candidates for president, and I made a comment that there are unfortunately some Jews, some leading Jews, who have aspired to save the entire world, but they're not particularly concerned about saving the Jewish people and the fate of the Jewish state. So you may guess about whom I'm talking. I don't want to talk politics, but I felt that was characteristic of one of our candidates for president. Well, anyhow, so to start with Washington. During the 1950s, the institutions of Reform Judaism developed programs of social action. There was a need to participate in society, to take stands on the major social issues confronting society. That was an integral part of Judaism. Without being concerned about what's happening in society, you can't be a Jew. The Midrash teaches us that when God created the universe, he purposely made everything incomplete. How so? Well, God could have, if he wanted to, he could have created bread. No, he didn't create bread. What did he do? He created wheat so that human beings would have to bake the wheat into bread. God, if he wanted to, could have created bricks. Why didn't he create bricks? Instead, he created clay out of the earth so that human beings would have to create the bricks, the clay, had to shape the clay into bricks. In other words, God made the earth of clay and made wheat grow so that every human being would be responsible for having to participate as a partner to God in the work of creation. Now, the American Reform Movement decided to build an institution called the Religious Action Center. And the proposal was brought up at a convention in November of 1959, and immediately the large congregations objected. Temple Emmanuel of New York left the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Washington Hebrew Congregation, when they heard that a young man would be, I was 33 years old, when they heard that a young man would be appointed to head the organization, the rabbi said, "We don't need any young whippersnapper to come to Washington to speak for the Jews of America," meaning I speak for the Jews of America. And there was so much opposition created to the establishment of this institution that the National Convention decided to hold off for another 2 years. And they spent 2 years trying to prepare the organization for the establishment of this center. We had found a donor, a very close personal friend of mine, who gave the money to purchase an old embassy on 21st in Massachusetts, 4-story embassy. And since I was the young whippersnapper, and since we had a 2-year period to educate the movement into the necessity for establishing this institution, I spent almost every Shabbat speaking at the major Reform congregations around the country. And there were huge crowds because it was a major controversial issue. I'll just tell you one vignette that happened in Cleveland, Ohio. There was a huge crowd. The rabbi was a very distinguished rabbi. There must have been at least 1,500 people there. And as often happens, I can't do it when I'm sitting down. This is the first time, as I told you, I'm sitting down. I need to stand up in order to emote properly. But I had dinner with the rabbi and a very distinguished lay leader. And during the course of my sermon, I began to wax emotional. And I said, why aren't there more Jews up front? Why don't we take more collective action as Jews? At the time, there were only 6 Jews in Congress, if I'm not mistaken. Today, I think there are well over 30 Jews in Congress, in both the Senate and the House. And so I began to wax emotional. I said, we need more Jews up front. Not enough just to be behind other people's election. Why can't Jews run for office? Why can't we take more collective action? And I saw out of the corner of my eye the man who had introduced me. And I was totally impressed with him, overwhelmed. And I said, why shouldn't there be a Senator Howard Metzenbaum of the state of Ohio? And the congregation, you're not supposed to applaud, the congregation broke out in tremendous applause. And you're not supposed to do that, right, in shul? Later on, I'll tell you what happens in a black church. I've spoken at many black churches. After the services were over and people were around congratulating me and all that stuff, Howard Metzenbaum came up to me and he said, Dick, you know, I thought that it was not possible for a Jew to run for a high public office in the state of Ohio. No Jews ever run for public office in the state of Ohio. I'm going to try. And you know what happened? 10 years later, Howard Metzenbaum became senator of the state of Ohio. And the first letter he wrote, and it's in one of my books, I put the letter in total in one of my books, to the man who first nominated me as senator of the state of Ohio. I was very proud of that letter, and later on we became very close friends. We opened the center at the beginning of 1962, and one of the first visitors was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a good friend of a very prominent rabbi in Atlanta, and the rabbi had told me about Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King about me, so he came to visit me. We had just arrived after just a day or two in Washington. And I found out the poor guy had no money, didn't have an office in Washington. And I went into this 4-story building, and the first day I walked in, I was with a secretary alone in a 4-story building. So I said to him, we began to call each other by the first name. I said, Martin, listen, I've got this big 4-story building. I'll give you an office anytime you want. And he accepted. So whenever he came to Washington, I provided an office for him, and we became very good friends. I wanted to fill up the building with like-minded groups. So one of the first things I did was invite various organizations to share in our facilities. And one of the organizations I invited was the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which was the umbrella group of all of the civil rights, religious groups, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, who were interested in the issue of civil rights. And we had a beautiful wood-paneled conference room, and I was always very proud that all of the deliberations related to the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, and there were a number of laws, 64, 65, 66, all of them took place in a Jewish conference room in a Jewish building. And they all had to go through our building, which to me was a source of great pride, and also to all of the Jewish community. To this day, I think that is considered to be the most important development of that institution. And you should know that without the Jewish groups, the civil rights legislation would not have been passed. The Jews were the experts, the Jewish organizations knew what they were doing, and they did the work. And we should all be proud of that. Sometimes the rest of the world forgets it, but you should know that we should not forget it. Selma, Alabama. Selma, if you remember, was a small city, comparatively small city, with an equally divided population between Jews and, not Jews, between whites and blacks. There were very few Jews in Selma, Alabama, although there was a congregation there. But Selma, Alabama became the focal point for the struggle to win voting rights for blacks. And you may remember that in March of 1965, Martin Luther King organized a march of local black leaders to the county courthouse in order to register to vote. And the sheriff, who was a hard-bitten segregationist, organized a posse of volunteer deputies, many of whom, incidentally, were members of the Ku Klux Klan, openly members of the Ku Klux Klan. He organized these voluntary deputies to prevent the blacks from entering the courthouse and registering to vote. And Martin Luther King issued a call overnight to have clergymen come to offer support. And I got a call the next morning from, they beat the blacks without any, brutally, without mercy. And I got a call the next morning from the head of the Council of Churches, and he said, Dick, we've reserved 15 places on a plane to Selma. We're leaving today at around 1 o'clock. Find us a rabbi, will you? We have 13 Protestant members. We've got one Catholic minister who's going. We need a rabbi. I so happened wasn't able to go because I was attending an important meeting at the White House on the civil rights legislation. I said, I promise I'll find you a rabbi. I called 4 or 5 rabbis. People were afraid to go. There were people who had already been killed. More would be killed later on. And I saw that I wasn't able to find anybody. And I had this meeting at the White House, but I knew that this was more important. So I went to, first thing I did was I called up Bella. We had these 4 little kids at home. And I said, Bella, I can't find a rabbi to go to Selma, Alabama. I think I should go. Is it all right? And Bella said, like she always has said, you have to go, even though it was comparatively dangerous. So the fellow called me back and said, did you find me a rabbi? I said, yeah. He said, who? I said, me. And so I dashed home, picked up a few belongings, and got on the plane just in time. And I sat next to one of my closest friends. It was a very well-known bishop of the Methodist Church, John Wesley Lord. And we were good friends. We sat next to each other. We went to each other. We went to Selma, Alabama. We get to Selma, and we were picked up by some of the people. We go to the church. There were thousands of people outside. The church was packed, the rafters, and they put me up together with a couple of the other leaders on the stage. And Martin Luther King is speaking. Television's all over, covering everything. Martin Luther King gets done speaking. He says, "Dick, you're next." I was totally unprepared. I decided to give 3 sentences, 3 thoughts. The 3 thoughts lasted a half hour, and I consider it the greatest talk I ever gave in my life. How is that possible? I decided to use Jewish tradition. And I said the first thought is that when God created man, he created man, only one man. If God knew that he was going to populate the world with millions and billions of people, why did he only create one man? And the answer given by Jewish tradition is, so that no one would ever be able to say, my father is better than your father. And I finished that sentence, and in contrast to what happens in our shuls, the congregation broke out in applause and dancing and said, "Give him to a rabbi, give him hell, rabbi, that's it." And they started dancing in the aisles for 10 minutes. And Martin Luther King quieted them down, and I gave my second thought. When God created man, he created man using dust from the 4 corners of the earth. Why? So that no one would ever be able to say, the place from which I come is better than the place from which you come. Nachamo, dancing in the aisles, singing, dancing, hallelujah, brother, you give it to him, rabbi, give him hell. And Martin Luther King quieted him down, and I gave my third thought. And when God created man, he used every color of dust. Why? So that no one would ever be able to say, the color of my skin is better than the color of your skin. And Nochamo, dancing, and finally King quieted him down, and I gave a few closing remarks, and that was it. So as I say, that I think was the greatest talk I ever gave. Not one word was mine, but it was the most glorious expression of Judaism, and I was very proud of our Jewish tradition. That night, there was only one hotel in Selma, Alabama, and the newspaper people, the television people were using the hotel. So they made arrangements for those of us who would come to sleep at the home of local residents. And since we were such good friends, Bishop John Wesley Lord and I decided to room together. And we went to the home of an African-American washerwoman, a one-room hovel. And she had a double bed, and she had prepared clothing, a bedspread and linen for herself on the floor. And we remonstrated with her, and we said, "No, we'll sleep on the floor." She started to cry. She said, "No, I prepared the bed for you." So the bishop and I got into bed and spent the night together. Now, nowadays, people might have different thoughts, but in those days, nobody even thought in those terms. And so we spent the night together. And we woke in the morning, and we became aware that outside were dozens of newspaper people and reporters, and we got dressed and we walked outside. And they asked us all kinds of questions. How did it feel, Rabbi, sleeping with a bishop? And how did it feel sleeping with a rabbi, and so forth? So when they said to me, "Rabbi, how did it feel sleeping with Bishop John Wesley Lord?" So I said, the truth is I hoped, or at least I prayed, that sooner or later I would sleep with the Lord. but never did I ever dream that I would sleep with a bishop. And that hit the newspapers, and there was quite a bit of publicity because it was a nice human interest story. Well, the next phase of life deals with Jerusalem and Israel. Israel's always been an important part of our lives. I was a peculiar kid. They tell me I was rambunctious. I don't remember. But one thing that was really peculiar about me was that I liked Hebrew school. Who ever heard of a Jewish kid in those days liking Hebrew school? But I fell in love somehow or other with the Hebrew language. And when I was a young man, I talked with Joe about this. He was also won some oratorical contests. I won the National Young Judea Oratorical Contest when I was 13 years old. And I became a hero, a youth hero. And I gave that what is now, of course, a very platitudinous talk about the importance of Israel. This was 1940, long before the state was established. And I became a kind of a youth hero and gave that little platitudinous talk maybe 100 times all over town. And then, of course, I decided to be a rabbi. And I was the first rabbinic student to leave as an undergraduate to go to Israel to study at the Hebrew University. And I had a great year. I worked in archaeological excavations. I studied with the top professors at the Hebrew University. And I came back, I perfected my Hebrew, and I came back and in those days, the senior students, I was a senior by that time, the senior students had to give a sermon, which was highly criticized by the student body and the faculty. And after the services, the students would sit around and the faculty and critique the sermon. I said, the gist of what I said was that without Zionism, there's no Judaism. And there was an uproar among the students. What do you mean without Zionism? The Jewish state, this is 1949 and 50. The Jewish state had just been established. What do you mean? Without Zionism, you can't have the Jewish people? And one of the very distinguished professors at the college was Dr. Leo Beck. Have you heard the name? A very distinguished man. There are many institutions named after him. He was an angel. I loved him. But instead of the whole student body staying afterwards and criticizing the sermon, they were very critical of what I had said. Dr. Beck said, I want to talk to Richard alone. And everybody vacated the chapel, and he said to me, Richard, he said, I want to ask you a very serious question. The state of Israel has just been established. Supposing it was not established. It's a miracle that it was approved. But it couldn't have. The UN didn't have to pass the resolution, and with difficulty they have passed the resolution. Supposing there wouldn't be a Jewish state, you mean the Jewish people wouldn't survive? And I said, Dr. Beck, I don't think so. I don't think that now, only one generation after our cognizance of the Holocaust, I don't think that now the Jewish people could survive creatively and fully without the Jewish state. We need the Jewish state in order to perpetuate the Jewish people. And he said, Richard, and I discovered for the first time in my life that this saint, whom everybody loved, was not a political Zionist. He was among those who wanted to have a binational state. And to this day, there are still people who want to have a binational state. I think it would have been impossible to have a Jewish Arab state. We know what happened in Quebec. We know what's happening in Belgium, and wherever you go. We need the Jewish state. But my talk gave such cause for controversy that I went through hell at the college with both the faculty and the student body. Well, along came the Six-Day War, and those dark days of May 1967, when Nasser had blockaded the Straits of Tiran and asked that the UN emergency forces be withdrawn, and it looked as if only a generation after our cognizance of the Holocaust, once again the Jews would be in danger of extinction. There were only 2.5 million Jews in those days. And I went to my friends. We were brothers. We used to testify jointly on civil rights issues. The top leadership of the Protestant and Catholic Church. They were over our home for Sukkot, for example. We put up a beautiful sukkah. We invited all kinds of friends, including the civil rights leadership, including the key ministers of the Protestant Church and all the monsignors of the Catholic Church. And I went to them for help. There was not one, my organization, I had my staff go, there wasn't one, not one, Protestant or Catholic organization that took a position in behalf of Israel. And when I asked them the question, what's the heck's wrong with you guys? What's the difference between our action in behalf of the civil rights issues? We testified jointly. What's the difference between this that's now happening to the threat to extinguish the Jewish people and our action in behalf of civil rights legislation? And they said, Dick, you don't know the difference? That was a clear-cut moral issue. But this is a highly complex political issue. I said, you mean civil rights was morality? And the right of the Jewish people to have a state is politics? And that was the answer, yes. We had tremendous arguments. And there was a deep rift between the Jewish organizations and all the other organizations. And so in the fall, we decided, I wrote a major article which was widely disseminated, in which I attacked what I called the perfidy and the immorality of the Protestant and Catholic Church. And so we decided to hold a conference in the fall. And I was asked to, I'd written this very important article, which was widely disseminated, and I was asked to present the Jewish case at this high-level conference, which I did. And I hit forcefully. What I wrote is in one of my books. And I got done speaking, and a very close friend, and a very prominent clergyman, Protestant clergyman, said, Dick, he said, I always thought, we're going to quote him directly, I always thought you Jews were the prototype of the universal man. But now, having listened to you, I see you are only a bunch of tribal particularists. Pretty tough language. There was great anger, and it carries over to this day. You see it in some of the actions of the Protestant mainline, particularly Protestant mainline churches, which have the BDS movement. They haven't accepted the right of Jews to have a state because they think of Jews as a religion. And the sad truth is that many Jews now define ourselves as a religion only. And if we're religion only, we die. Because the essence of Jewishness is peoplehood. And that's what Israel represents. Well, I had some rough time. Actually, Bill, I can tell you, I lost 15 pounds. I was so damn angry and so frustrated. I lost 15 pounds during the month of May. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. And I had gone through such frustration with the experience of trying to get support for the state of Israel. There's no question in my mind that had Israel not taken forceful, preemptive action, today there wouldn't be a Jewish state. And we as Jews have to remember that. Well, but then I said to myself, why the heck should I be so angry at the non-Jews? It's easier in a way to be angry at non-Jews than at Jews. But what about your own Jews? What about the Reformed Jews, in which I was one of the leaders? So I spent the summer working on various proposals. And one of the proposals I came up with was to change the metaphor of what was considered to be the relationship between the Jews of the diaspora and the Jews of Israel. We had used a metaphor called Bavel Yerushalayim, Babylon, Jerusalem. Why Babylon? Babylon was you remember after the destruction of the first temple, the Jews were exiled to Babylon. And in Babylon, there grew a tremendous Jewish community. The destruction of the temple was in 586 BCE. And if you take a look at, just to show you the difference between the Babylonian Jewish community and the Jerusalem Jewish community, if you look at the Talmud, there's a Jerusalem Talmud and a Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is 20 volumes, big, huge volumes. The Jerusalem Talmud is one volume. Because the Jews of Babylon were wealthy and prestigious and prominent, and the Jews of Palestine were never schnorrers. And but that was the way that the Jewish world looked upon what should be the proper relationship. Babylon, that's the America, and Jerusalem, those are the Jews in Israel. So I said, we got to change that metaphor. I don't accept it anymore after the 6-Day War. So I came up with a new metaphor. And I said, the metaphor from now on, after the 6-Day War, and after we became so conscious of what should be the relationship to Israel, the metaphor should be, Israel is Broadway, and the diaspora is off Broadway. And all hell broke loose. Everybody, all of the Jewish leaders, not just the Reform leaders, they criticized me. They said, what are you doing? You're deprecating the American diaspora? Where's the money going to come from? Where's the political pressure going to come from? I said, that's the future. Israel is Broadway. That's the center stage. That's the place where Jewish destiny will be determined. That's where the action is. And we've got to recognize that. Until we recognize that, we will not have the proper relationship. Well, in those days, what I said was only an ideological statement. It raised the hackles of a lot of people. I still have scars on my back. But what in those days, 50 years ago, was an ideological statement has today become a demographic reality. Because today, there were only 2.5 million Jews in Israel during the Six-Day War. Today, the largest Jewish population in the world is in Israel. And demographers project, I have a friend, Sergio de la Pergola, who's the most famous Jewish demographer of the world today. He projects that by the middle of this century, just the middle of this century, 57% of the Jews in the world will be living in Israel, 35% will be living in North America, and only 8% in the rest of the diaspora. So what in those days appeared to be and you could have had an argument with me, today there's no argument. Israel is the center of Jewish life. And we have to act accordingly, we in the Jewish world. I knew in advance, I spent the summer, I presented all kinds of proposals, many of which we've subsequently implemented. I knew in advance that it would create controversy. I love controversy because controversy, I learned in Washington. Controversy is the way to get things done. You disagree with people, and then you got a basis if you respect each other. And in Jewish tradition, one of the most beautiful sentences in the Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, is Kol machloket l'shem shomayim sofa yitkayem. Whatever controversy is engaged in for the sake of heaven will lead to salutary results. So sure, go ahead and argue, but it's good. It's good for you, and it's good for the community, and it's good results. So I had a number of proposals. I said what we have to do is we have to move the international headquarters of the world movement from New York to Jerusalem, the heart of the Jewish people. And the people said, we don't even have any rights there. Our rabbis can't function there. What are you talking about? I said, but the only way to get there and to function is to be there and fight for it. The second development was we got to build a movement in Israel. You can't just Schreigewald from afar. You got to be there. You got to build a movement. And the third was we have to affiliate with the various organizations that represent world Jewry, like the Jewish Agency and the Jewish National Fund and the World Zionist Organization and the World Jewish Congress. I injected many of my pet aphorisms into the discussion. For example, I said, we have to root ourselves in the soil and the soul of the Jewish people. And until you root yourself in the soil of the Jewish people, you can't root yourself in the soul of the Jewish people. And I said we have to create facts, not just send faxes, create facts. And you have to have messengers in Israel who deliver the message. Don't send it from abroad, Washington and New York at your conventions. Be there, build, create. There's this old, another one of my aphorisms was, there was this old Zionist song, I'm sure those of you who were active in Young Judea remember, Anu banu artsa livnot lehi banot ba. What does it mean? We've come to Israel to build and to be built through her. Not only do you build, but you yourself are changed. That was the important thing. What have we done? Well, Bill and I had no intention to go to Israel. The work that I was engaged in Washington was so exciting. So I was elected as the chairman to find somebody to go to Israel. And I couldn't find anybody of stature. And everybody kept saying, what about you? I said, why should I leave Washington? It's the greatest place in the world. And we're doing some very exciting work here, and very important work. But we couldn't find anybody. And so I was selected as the head of the World Reform Movement, and we moved to the offices. What have we done? Well, we've done quite a bit. We have the Hebrew Union College, this wonderful academic center of ours. I'm sure you've all seen our campus there. Those of you who've been to Israel, next door to the King David Hotel. We've ordained 100 rabbis already. We have 100 Israeli men and women who have decided to be Reform rabbis. We've put up schools and kindergartens. We have one of the best schools in the country, called the Leo Beck School, incidentally, in Haifa. We put up 2 kibbutzim. We have a magnificent campus to which I just referred, for which I helped raise the money and put up the buildings. We have an Israel Religious Action Center, and you've all heard about the Women of the Wall and all of those efforts on our part. The issue of rights, it's going to be a rough battle. People always ask me, when are you going to get rights? Mashiach Zeiten. Because the peculiar Israeli political system, the electoral system, is such that it's a parliamentary system, and no party has ever had a majority. So since no party has had a majority, what you have to do is in order to establish a government of 61 out of 120 seats in the Knesset, you have to have someone who is the leading party, the party that has the plurality and is asked to establish the government, has to establish a coalition. And who do you establish a coalition with? In many cases, the Orthodox parties. In almost every case, you have the Orthodox parties, because all they demand is continuing control over marriage, divorce, conversion, burial, everything that's important in their personal life. Since for most of the Jews, those issues are not as important as foreign policy, so therefore the average Israeli will compromise, and he'll say, okay, in order to establish the government, to get our way on the diplomatic score, so we'll compromise a little bit and give it to them. But we've made great headway, and we're continuing to make headway. And in order for Israel to guarantee freedom of religion, we'll have to learn how to guarantee freedom from religion. And that's going to be a rough thing. Well, I've described and had discussions with many of you, which have been very interesting to me. Everybody talks about, with great pride, about his, when I've met with you and you've met with us, you talk with great pride about how your grandparents or great-grandparents or parents came from Europe, right? And they came through Ellis Island. And you talk about how they sacrificed and built their lives. It's interesting if you analyze what you people say, that when your relatives, your predecessors, came to this country and they came to Ellis Island, they stood next to Irish, Greek, Italian, French. And when they were asked, I'll use it as an example, my family. My one grandparent, my maternal grandparent came from the Ukraine. My grandparents came from the Ukraine. My mother was born in a shtetl in the Ukraine. My father's family came from Hungary. But when the official at Ellis Island asked them, what are you? And they what did they say? Hungarian? Ukrainian? They said Jew. When they said Jew, what did they mean? They meant they were on a par with ethnic groups. They were like Greeks and Germans and Italians and French. Today, if you ask their great-great-grandchildren, what are you? And if they say Jew, and there are many who, unfortunately, today will not say Jew, but if they say Jew, they don't mean they're on a par with Greek, French, Italian, German. They mean they're on a par with Protestant and Catholic. Why? Because they define themselves as a religion only. But I want to tell you something. If we in America contract our identity into religion only, then Jewishness in America will disappear. Because we're not just a religion only. We're a people. And a people has a language, a culture, a land. And where is that manifest? It's manifest in Israel. And every one of you recognizes. You know, many of you have told me with great pride, my granddaughter just came back from birthright. What is birthright? In 8 days, your grandchild goes to Israel and suddenly he gets an injection of Yiddishkeit. Becomes he recognizes not just a religion, they don't go to shul anyhow. But you're part of a people, a worldwide people. And that comes from Israel. So the Jewish soul cannot flourish without the Jewish body. And that's why I've stressed all along that American Jewry has to participate in Israel. We have to be there, American institutions have to be there in force, and particularly the religious movements. And I'm talking about the conservative and the reform. I've talked all my life about we have to merge the conservative and reform movements. I've written articles about it, but there's nobody to listen to on the other side. But it doesn't make any difference. We need Israel in order to survive. And without the presence of our American Jewish institutions in Israel, then Israel would be incomplete, just as we would be unfulfilled. Well, I want to allow some time maybe for questions. I think that somebody asked me the other day, do you think it's okay for American Jews to criticize Israel because we don't live there? And I said, what do you mean, I think it's all right to criticize? If you don't criticize, you don't feel you're part of it. You not only have every right to criticize, you got every obligation to criticize. And there's much in Israeli society about which to criticize. Government policy. And each Jew, no matter where he lives, should feel free to criticize. There are times when we're painfully aware of the shortcomings and disabilities of Israeli society and of Israeli government policy. But there are times when the reality of Israel seems far distant from the dream. But I always ask the question, would we be better off with only the dream? Is it not a blessing to be able to wrestle with the reality rather than just limit ourselves to the dream? The best example I know of how Israel has impacted on all of us is what's happened to Soviet Jewry. After I retired at age 73, theoretically, but then I spent the next 9 years as head of the Russian desk of the Jewish Agency, working professionally. And Bella, I mentioned Bella's from Russia, she and I, during the course of many years, established the reform movement in Russia. We now have 40 congregations, and the largest youth movement in Russia. But there's no example better than Soviet Jewry of the impact on Israel, on diaspora Jewry than the example of Soviet Jewry. When Elie Wiesel wrote the book Jews of Silence, the Jews in Russia were silent. Today, the Jewish community has been revivified, such as it is. Whatever the long-range future is, something else. But the there's no better example of the impact on Israel. If it had not been for Israel and the Six-Day War, those millions and millions of Jews in Russia would not be Jews. We were privileged, Bill and I, to be in the Soviet Union. We were sent on a special mission in 1969. And in those days, it was very dangerous to be a Jew. But the Jews, somehow or other, came out on Simchat Torah in Moscow. You all remember that, how dramatic it was? And they would dance the hora with Russian guards surrounding them. In those days, it was impossible to observe Jewishness. People were still being put in jail. Sharansky, who was a good friend of mine, Sharansky was put in jail, if you remember, just for studying Hebrew. And there in the crowd, and this is in Simchat Torah, in Rosh Hashanah, in Moscow, in Simchat Torah, we met an old man, and he took us aside, and in Yiddish, he said, you know, to me, Israel is my entire life. He said, there's Voice of Israel broadcasts every night at 11 p.m. They have 7 broadcasts during the course of a day. And at the end of every broadcast, they would play Hatikva, which is the Israeli national anthem, the meaning of which is hope, Hatikva. He said, but for some reason, they've stopped playing Hatikva at the end of every broadcast, and now they only play it at the end of the 2 a.m. There's 7 broadcasts a day. They only play it at the end of the broadcast at 2 a.m. And I'm an old man, and I can't stay up that late. He said, when you get back to Israel, do me a favor, for one old Jew, ask him to play Hatikva after every broadcast. We came back and we did. And they began to play Hatikva again. And he said to us, I would be so grateful, because when I hear those words and melody, I say to myself, no matter how grievous the oppression and discrimination, nevertheless, there's Hatikva, there's hope. So they started playing Hatikva again. And I say, with this I'm summarizing what I want to tell you, our task, the task of every Jew, is to play Hatikva. Because where the Jews are, there's history. Where there's history, there's a future. And where there's a future, there's hope.